It had only been 2 weeks since the humans had fended off the assault of the massive goblin army. 2 weeks since the goblins had pulled together their best to try and take down the humans, make them into their own slaves, their own toys. 2 weeks since humanity reminded them, you do something around and then you find out. Now, normally, for the locals, after 2 weeks, you'd still be reeling from it. It would take 6 months to a year before you're ready to send any type of force against them, before you're ready to rally enough personnel, enough equipment to actually make a dent in the enemy. But after 2 weeks, the humans were already getting ready to party. It amazed the locals how fast they assembled. More soldiers had come through the gate. Tons and tons of equipment was being brought across and assembled. They couldn't understand the full logistics chain that was required for something like this. They were told how it worked, and of course many of the locals had started their own shops, but they were absolutely astounded how fast the humans would rearm, reload, and repair everything, along with putting everything else together, some of which were vehicles they had never even thought of before, something that was strange to look at. But when they found out that the humans were going to take the fight to their former oppressors, they wanted a piece of the action. Hell, they wanted more than a piece. They wanted the whole damn thing. However, for this to happen, to work alongside the humans, they had to be checked out. They had to be checked out to see what type of abilities they had and where they would be best suited. Of course, it went out that they would only take the strongest men and some of the strongest women. No children, no one under the age of 16, which was surprising for them, because they believed after 14 summers you were considered an adult. This grossed out many of the humans, which, to the locals, not surprised, were confused at this. Though once they had their numbers plussed up, new gear was brought in. New type of outerwear, long coats, armor, and certain weapons were brought in. However, they needed to be taught how to use it, so it would be another week before they even had a modicum of an idea of what to do. Many of those who were the big bruisers couldn't fit their hands inside the trigger well, even though you could open it up, so they just stuck with the clubs and swords and things like that, mainly shields, as they realized that the strength of the shield could not be underestimated. As it turned out, most of them would be mainly support. Things like scouting, where anyone who had any modicum of elf blood would be perfectly suited for. Artillery. Any of the big bruisers carrying up the artillery shells would be so helpful. It'd be like Wojtek on crack. And as soon as everyone believed they were ready, it was time to move out. The additional vehicles helped out a lot, especially since there were many more humans. But the strange thing is, the locals were used to seeing the humans in a more jovial sense. They used to joke around, drink, and have all sorts of fun with the locals. But now, the humans all had a strange look. Almost all of them had their eyes covered with a strange, dark piece of what they learned to be called plastic. They were all deadly serious. Though some had slightly different uniforms, they all seemed to have the same mentality. As they went on their way, many of the locals were told that the humans were just getting their minds right. Were their minds wrong? They didn't understand. Though once fully explained, they more or less got the gist of it. However, they were still under the mistaken assumption that they would have plenty of time, as the military had to move in, set up their tents, and start doing all the other things that they had to do before war. Many of the former slaves had watched the war, not just been cannon fodder, so to speak. Though they came to find out really quick that humans are on a completely different timetable. In a journey that should have taken almost 3 weeks to walk, they got there in 4 days. The only reason for the 4 days is they constantly had to stop to allow people to refresh themselves, to relieve themselves, and of course, fuel up the vehicles themselves. Eventually, they would find themselves outside the Empire's crown city, a jewel of a city, at least by medieval standards. Everyone realized why they were there instead of trying to take out one of the closer generals and taking out several of the other castles like they did before. If they cut off the head of this snake, the chances of the body still fighting are minimal. Everything was so much faster than expected. The humans did not set up tents or anything like that. No, the vehicles themselves seemed to simply unpack themselves, and some of the trailers, even that they had brought, simply opened up into other areas. Some of them even had what seemed like magic that cooled them off on the inside so that those suffering from the heat would not have to suffer for very long, as they could go in, just take a few moments, relax, and then go back out, and they were completely rejuvenated. Though a surprise to seem some sort of luxury item like this, they did have to remember they were on the battlefield. They knew that they had been spotted on the way there. Moving any group of this large is going to kick up a lot of dust, make a lot of noise, and of course the scouts spotted them. With this, the enemy would see them and simply retreat. Though in their absolute haste to run, they almost always left their slaves behind. Humans would see this and realize that many of the slaves were extremely malnourished, always in heavy chains, and it seemed as though they were used for recreation as well. What made it worse is when they found several of the slaves had been slashed with blades. In one case, still had an axe inside their abdomen, slowly bleeding out as the humans got there. They saw that this was a young female, used as some sort of toy. And as the word got back, the humans seemed to get more and more angry. The locals pulled away at this, as they didn't like to see the humans when they're angry. It made them very, very nervous. The entire convoy had stopped outside the city and put up a type of banner they learned about to show that they were interested in talking, and they wanted some sort of parley before all the fireworks began. Unfortunately, they had to wait 2 days before the goblins actually grew a pair and sent a representative out. But the representative was not alone. As he waddled up in these extremely flamboyant clothes, all sorts of colors and design, draped with all sorts of jewels and gold, carrying some sort of weird scepter, he was only covered by another goblin, seemingly a shaman, and then behind them he pulled a chain of over 80 slaves. The slaves, as they walked up, everyone could see, looked like hell. Mostly, they were injured males as they limped, some of them missing fingers, arms, eyes, one of them missing a foot, seemingly walking on a peg leg that looked terrible, like they had just shoved a piece of wood inside his ankle and called it good. Along with that, there were females, but these females, they were broken. They didn't look up. They didn't even seem to blink. They didn't talk. They just stood there like statues. Those that had seen this before were unbelievably pissed off and wanted to go immediately to the slaves as they could feel their power being pulled out as the slaves got close, but they didn't fight it at all. The command had to tell everybody to hold your place, stand fast, don't move, as the command decided to talk to this lone goblin. The goblin, clearly scared, but holding it together, which made everybody almost laugh at him, told that he was offering that they could take these slaves. The gold that he was offering, as one of the slaves came up with a chest that was completely packed with basically doubloons. And of course, several magic items which the shaman himself had laid out. If they take these items, the Goblin King will remove all transgressions, and they will simply have an armistice, a peace treaty. But they must leave and never return. And if nothing else, this will show the dominance of the goblins over all others, as they could see several of the slaves were watching, along with many of their soldiers on the ramparts. The battlements were just full of them as they watched this all happen. The command looked back and forth, and they looked over Sergeant Major, what do you think? The Sergeant Major simply pulled his pistol and blew the shaman's brains out, as the shaman was clearly trying to charge his own staff as he was standing behind the dignitary. Well, I guess that answers it, says the command. No negotiations. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to go back and you're going to release all the slaves. Or we're going to slaughter every single one of you. Along with that, you're going to release all the females that you're holding as toys. With that, he cringed, and everybody there seemed to tighten their muscles at the thought of that. He continued, or we're going to slaughter every single one of you. You will then tell him he needs to surrender unconditionally, or I swear to all that is holy and unholy, I will cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. With that, the goblin didn't quite know the phrase where it came from, but he truly understood the meaning. He tried to reach down and take the riches and grab the hold of the chain. This was not going to happen. The humans ran up and grabbed the chain from his hand, ripping it out to the point where it actually caused damage. Along with that, another one stepped on the chest so the goblin could not raise it. They told him to go back, but he's going back with only this message. The goblin himself turned up and claimed that this is unfair. This was supposed to be a brokerage for peace, and since we have not brokered a peace, this should go back with me. One of the commanders walked forward. Really, this was peaceful, and you want to talk about fair? He reached over to the closest female, one that barely looked into her teens. He grabbed the side of her rags and pulled it up, exposing the side of her thigh. Even though the power from all those humans around was healing it, it was clear that she had been basically gouged out. Many different claw marks were seen, even though they were healing. It was clear that she had been held down and violated so many times that she didn't even know what being alive was anymore. You want to talk fair, he said. As he stood in front of the goblin, he said, where we come from, we have a phrase, don't shoot the messenger. However, he looked over to the shaman and kicked it slightly. That one's not the messenger. And you want to talk fair. What about fair treatment for them? Right now, the only thing fair is holding my soldiers back from not killing you where you stand. Now, since you are the lowest level noble that they decide to send out here because you're clearly expendable, you can return to your master and you can deliver the message. If not, we'll just kill you here and chuck your head over the wall. The goblin, clearly shaking, was trying to hold it together, but he was, as he turned, starting to urinate on his own legs out of fear. He slowly made it back, but he was completely wobbly all the way. Even as the drawbridge came down, you could see him trying desperately not to go into a full run, as he didn't want to be anywhere near the humans. The slaves were immediately pulled in, and some of the younger soldiers began to pass out as the slaves passed by. Those that hadn't been inside the gate for very long didn't know how to control the energy drain, and now they had even bigger problems. To their absolute surprise, as soon as they got the slaves over and started feeding them, they started to rotate the soldiers around and through them so they didn't spend more than 2 or 3 minutes around the slaves. This allowed them to rotate through and not drain themselves, and the slaves started to feel much better. Unfortunately, most of them can't or wouldn't talk. In some cases, if they were a male and they talked too much, their tongues had been ripped out. They were actually surprised. As they ate, they could suddenly taste the food and then realize that their tongues were growing back. With this, they ate even more and more and more. It seemed as though they were going to eat every single one of the sea rations or kitchen rations they had. It didn't matter. They could get more. And it didn't matter to any of the soldiers. It wouldn't be the first time they skipped a meal after all. With all this going on, The command decided to count up all the riches and whatnot, and wanted to send a report back. One of the RTOs simply looked at the command and followed through what he was going to do. However, instead of sending one message to one command, no, he sent the message to all the governments that were involved. That way, it was going to piss off the politicians something fierce. The officers should have realized most enlisted folks really, really hate politics. It's got no place on their battlefield. While this was all going on, the goblins were already giving their answer. They weren't sending a messenger or anything out, but they began to prepare along the walls. They could see the soldiers getting everything ready. They couldn't see inside the walls as they only had a few drones in, but the problem is the drones were every once in a while getting popped by magic, so they knew there was at least a couple shamans still inside. However, they believed the plan could still go off without a hitch. The humans waited. The medieval style of artillery, of catapults and trebuchets, began to fire, but they all fell short. They still exploded in a little bit of a fireball, but the humans would joke to everyone, "What is that? I could go piss that out." No, they don't know anything about fire. With that, everyone started to say something really strange the locals couldn't understand. It was a strange chuckle as they went, "Ha, ha, fire's cool, ha, ha, fire's cool." With that, the mortars were dialed in. Thanks to the drones, they were able to get just enough of a picture to give accurate fire. The mortars screeched over the wall and started to hit the trebuchets, blowing them to pieces along with the crews to man them. Now it was the ballistas' turn. The ballistas realized if they fired flat, there was no way they were going to reach the tanks, so they tried to arc their fire as best they could. They aimed specifically at the tanks as they believed those were the biggest threat. As the ballista bolts began to fire, solid pieces of metal began to fly across the battlefield, slow arcing. And with that, you started to hear the humans start yelling, "Incoming!" And with that, everyone moved out of the way, but the tanks didn't move. The clanging of metal as they hit the ground, striking the tanks, everyone believed that the crew might be in trouble, but not a single penetrative round struck. The tanks were already on the radio, and as the turrets began to move, everyone realized it's time to cover their ears. The tanks, in methodical order, began to blow the top of the turrets off of the wall. They left the battlements alone, but the turrets themselves, with all the ballistas, were now gone. They began to wonder, why wasn't there a shield? When they first assaulted, why wasn't there an energy shield? And then they started to think maybe they had taken out too many of the shaman. Maybe those that knew how to do shield magic just were gone. They didn't have any more. That's the only thing they could think of. Because if they did have an energy shield, this fight would take a lot longer. They would actually have to starve them out. Because everyone knows, during an old school medieval siege, it's not the fighting that kills most people, it's the starving. As they all started to celebrate their luck, the humans suddenly froze at what was being told. Upon the battlements, slaves were being walked up, an entire wall of them, another group of meat shields, everyone thought, until they realized that they were putting ropes around the slaves' necks. The snipers were told they were free to fire at will, take out those goblin soldiers, and they did. With accurate precision, they began to pop off their heads, and the heads burst like zits, spraying everyone. But the slaves wouldn't move, many of them too broken mentally to ever fight against it. They just stood there with the ropes around their neck, some of them praying, some of them shaking, others just completely devoid of emotion. With this, everyone was absolutely freaking out. Many of the commands were having trouble. Many of the NCOs couldn't hold their men back from wanting to charge in. It got so bad that a few of them were wrestled down to the ground. "Don't do anything stupid," they kept screaming at each other. "Don't charge in. You don't know what's waiting for you yet." But then, a bunch of the goblin soldiers decided to be sneaky. They got down as low as they could, got down below the battlements where the snipers couldn't hit them, not without striking one of the slaves, and then suddenly pushed off a large group of slaves which dangled on the wall, many of them still kicking as the rope became tight. You could almost hear them cry on the way down and then choke. With that, the word came down. The command simply said 2 words: cry havoc. With this, anybody with a clean shot began to fire. Any of those goblin soldiers way up on the ramparts simply found themselves under a hail of fire. Many of them tried to duck behind the stone walls and then found out that a 50 caliber Barrett's going to punch right through that shit. The tanks were given orders not to slaughter all the slaves, so they had to figure something out, and quickly they began to fire on the edges of the drawbridge in an attempt to bring it down, and they succeeded. The drawbridge came down much faster than it was supposed to, and everyone cheered as it clanged to the bottom. Once it was down, they still had one more issue to deal with: the wooden gate, the very thick wooden gate. Even driving a APC into it, or maybe even a tank, might not be enough to break it. It would end up causing them to be stuck there, and the last thing you want to be is inside a tank, blocking everybody from coming in and have hot oil and flaming arrows coming down to you. That would be bad. So the Bradleys, the only 4 that were able to be brought across and reassembled, began to use their 25mm cannons to start shredding the gate. As they began to pop through, they could see large pieces of wood being splintered and sprayed across. Those on the inside who thought they were safe suddenly realized these humans might have weapons strong enough to get through their strongest defenses. All of them tried to get ready for what was coming, but they had no idea. One of the tanks, finding out that the Bradleys had burned through almost all their armor-piercing ammo, and the HE was not doing enough to break apart all the wood, simply said, "I got it." With that, it ran down. Even over the radio, every chain of command was trying to get them to stop, but suddenly they heard that turbine engine crank up so high that many of them realized exactly what they were going to do. Just as they were about to hit the drawbridge, the turret rotated straight to 180 degrees, and it smashed into the gate, blowing it to splinters and ending up in the courtyard. The main gun spun around, and as soon as it got a target fired, the coax attached to the side began to rip through with 50 caliber rounds, tearing everything apart. And with that, the infantry realized they had an opening, and in they came. Many of the human commanders realized their plan had pretty much gone to shit, needed to bring everything to bear as soon as possible. So they called in their air support, what little they had. The little birds came in flying as close as they possibly could, using their rocket pods and miniguns to lay waste to anyone inside the courtyard, waiting to ambush the infantry as it charged in. However, they began to catch more and more fire. The shamans that were inside weren't using shields. They were not wasting their energy on that. Instead, they were using it for offensive magic. In one case, it tore the minigun and the landing skid off the side of the little bird. With this, they were surprised that they could do so much damage. The shamans must have realized they could do more and began to fire recklessly into the sky. Thankfully, it was reckless, as that gave time for the little birds to bank away. The Blackhawks that came in, trying to land an air assault mission right on top of the castle, realized they were catching too much as well. One of them came in and flew right in front of the cockpit, enough that the energy itself melted the glass. It wasn't enough to damage the folks inside, but it was enough to make it difficult for them to see. Eventually, they had to have one of their crew chiefs actually kick the glass out so that they could actually see. This meant that they didn't have air support anymore, but the infantry didn't care. Inside the castle, it was a frickin' bloodbath. As the humans went in, they immediately popped the top of their auto-injectors and jammed it into their arms or legs as they ran, trying any way to stay awake, so that they knew they could take down the goblins that they knew they had to destroy. inside the extremely small rooms and hallways. Sometimes they were brought into hand-to-hand combat. They began to find slaves everywhere after blasting a few of the goblin soldiers to pieces, but many of the slaves had been freshly murdered. Many of them, especially as they broke into the inner sanctum of the castle, realized that many of these slaves were given to other nobles and higher ranking generals as entertainment, and they didn't want this to fall in the hands of their enemy. The narcissism of these little green bastards was pretty apparent to everyone. Many, many soldiers saw this, and as the word came out, the goblins truly began to feel the fury of mankind, as the humans no longer cared if they lost a hand, a leg, an eye, if they got cut open, if they were bleeding out on the ground, if their energy was being sucked up by all those who were being slaughtered around them. They didn't care. They just continued to rip into them, some of them forsaking their firearms, simply pulling out small blades, jumping at the goblins and eviscerating them right there. The risk to the lives of those inside was severe. They would many times grab the slaves, hoping they were still alive, ripping the chains clean out of the wall out of a sheer fury and basically just being high on adrenaline, and run towards the opening, trying desperately to get to the front of the castle, trying to get them anywhere where a doc can do what a doc does. One of the videos that everyone saw was a soldier running out. He had a child in his arms, and the child was just covered in blood. This child looked like a cross between a dwarf, a goblin, an elf, and a minotaur. Nobody knew what type of genetics were messed up inside this kid. But as he ran up screaming medic, he ended up just slowing down, dropping to his knees. The adrenaline must have wore off. And before the docs could even get into him, his arms began to loosen, and the child began to go towards the ground. But as it did, the child, one that was clearly deceased, reached up and grabbed his shirt, and the look on his face as a small smile went across as he lost complete consciousness. Many humans had to be carried to the rear because their adrenaline had wore off. Natural and synthetic, it didn't matter. They were completely out of energy. Humans were believed to be low energy because of this, but it didn't matter. The anger, the rage of not only the humans but the locals who had a definite bone to pick with the goblins just wanted to save as many as possible. They might have been there to stack bodies, but they were also there to unstack bodies. By the end of the battle itself, which only took a few hours, from start to finish, from the first shot of medieval artillery until the last of the goblins was hanging from the battlements, the amount of blood that was coming out of that castle, this massive castle, had turned its own moat red. And as the castle itself burned, everybody consolidated what they had won and what they had lost. This was standard. They had actually saved almost all the goblin females used for forced breeding inside goblin society. The females were basically trinkets to be traded. They weren't actually alive to them. In fact, they were bred at such a young age, in many cases they didn't survive childbirth. Many of them were surprised and scared of the humans who showed up that would reach up, grab their slave collars, and in a rage rip them off. Though it was a very, very weak metal, it was still metal itself. Many humans broke their hands and had to re-heal them themselves doing so. Other slaves, several thousand, were freed and healed. The castle would be falling apart soon enough as everyone was pulled out. The search had already gone through the castle itself, top to bottom, left to right, from the highest tower to the lowest dungeon. They had gotten everything out that they wanted. The treasures were all seized and distributed as best they could for the time. But the one problem was the human losses. A full-on 12% of losses. Most of those lost their lives carrying the wounded, whether it be slave or ally or fellow soldier. They simply ran out of energy. Their own life energy was being sucked out at such a speed that many of them just fell over into a coma. And then their energy would flow into the one they were holding. In many cases, this meant bringing the one they were holding back from the absolute brink, but at the cost of the human themselves. Many of them would be fully honored for this, as their names would be immortalized throughout history for their own sacrifice. Seeing this, the command was going to send word to all the other kings. Now that their master was hanging from the battlements, maybe now the rest of them will listen. One of his subordinates yelled out, "I doubt it.